This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Claire McDonnell, and in the early hours of Sunday the 21st of April, these are our main stories. Sudanese military officials say deposed President Omar al-Bashir is being investigated for money laundering. At least 35 pro-government soldiers in Syria have been killed by Islamic State less than a month after US-backed forces declared victory over the terror group. And the US has announced a multi-million-dollar cleanup of Agent Orange contamination in Vietnam. Also in this podcast, disgraced film director Roman Polanski sues the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences after he's barred over allegations of sexual abuse of a minor. And
my message is not only to blind people or disabled people, but to ordinary people. Don't limit yourself. Limitation is in your brain.
Japan's Mitsuhiro Iwamoto has become the first blind sailor to cross the Pacific Ocean. Protests have continued in Sudan, where nearly 2 weeks after the toppling of the former president Omar al-Bashir, demonstrators are pushing for the ruling military to establish a civilian council. Sudanese military officials said earlier this week that Mr al-Bashir had been moved to a high-security prison in Khartoum. He was previously under house arrest. On Saturday, prosecutors said the former president is now being investigated for money laundering after sacks of cash in various international currencies were found at his home. Our Africa editor, Mary Harper, has more details.
There was euros, some dollars and also some Sudanese pounds, and these were all stuffed into grain sacks and kept in Mr al-Bashir's house. So great suspicion has arisen over this, hence the public prosecutor launching this investigation into possible money laundering and also holding foreign currency illegally. And this money has now been taken to the central bank in Khartoum.
OK, protest leaders are also holding talks with the military council ahead of their planned announcement of this transitional civilian authority. Protesters unhappy, as we heard there. They lack trust in the military. Take a listen to these people in Khartoum.
This is nothing. This is just something to calm the people and this. So it's just part of a play or something. They do it for the public to calm them down and to stop this, what's happening here.
Till now, they have done good. But we don't trust them that much because already there are a couple of people from the previous government. They're still in this government right now.
Not much faith in the sincerity of the military council. What could they do to win trust and therefore backing of the public?
Yeah, it's every time the military council makes concessions, and it's made several over the past few days, arresting Mr al-Bashir, putting him in a high-security jail, getting rid of a nighttime curfew, freeing political prisoners. None of it seems enough for the protesters. They want something more. What they want is a full civilian transitional administration, and they want that right now, and the military council isn't giving it to them, so they continue to be distrustful because think about it, 30 years of a military man being in control. It's difficult for the public to really trust anybody who's in the military.
And how important is stability for Sudan?
It's very important, and in fact, whilst all these protests are going on, the economy, which was the reason why they started protesting in the first place, that's being dragged even further down. Traffic is disrupted in Khartoum. But it's not just Sudan that you have to think about. It's the surrounding region as well, which is highly unstable. So a continuing unstable Sudan doesn't do much good for the Horn of Africa or North Africa.
Mary Harper. It was less than a month ago that US-backed forces in Syria declared victory over the Islamic State group in Syria. But the takeover of the last IS stronghold in Baghouz did not mean the organisation was truly eliminated. And a renewed offensive by the extremists has proved it. We now know at least 35 pro-Syrian government soldiers have been killed in the biggest IS operation since the fall of Baghouz. Our Arab Affairs editor is Sebastian Usher.
The area where IS still is operational in Syria is this great swathe of desert, which is in the centre of the country, a very remote area. Not many towns or cities based there at all. It's always been very difficult for the Syrian government to keep control of that area during the war. And there are a couple of towns where IS launched attacks on government soldiers and their allies. They came close to taking one of these towns. These are ambushes, essentially. Militias allied to the government then came in to give relief and essentially to save several hundred soldiers who were surrounded, who were besieged by IS. They drove IS away. This is the kind of pattern we were seeing during the war again and again when IS was at its height.
And we heard US-backed forces declaring victory over Islamic State, but the fact that they've regrouped, what does it tell us?
It depends what you mean by regroup. I mean, in the sense of having the caliphate they declared and the territory that's under their administration, that area that was the size of a UK at one point and that they were selling across the world as a place for people to come to, that's gone and that may never come back. But their ability to carry out these sorts of attacks, to carry out this kind of insurgency, which they had in Iraq for years before they suddenly erupted in 2014, and then in Syria a bit later, that continues and that shows no sign at the moment of fading. Now, that may be because a lot of the people we saw in Baghouz were ISIS members of ours who've been forced from one place to another to that edge of the country. Others had never been involved in that, who remained in sleeper cells in these remote areas. And in a sense, that had continued throughout that battle. So this is what we're seeing now. And in Iraq, where the declaration of complete victory over ISIS was announced more than a year ago, this is a daily occurrence. And it is the same pattern that we saw in the lead up to IS breakout in 2014. So it remains very worrying. It creates instability, it creates fear, and it creates a sense amongst the people in these areas that the government, that the state still doesn't really have any control, and that they're still, in a sense, prey to ISIS, either directly from attack, if they are seen as siding with the government, or it's fertile ground in areas where the government isn't able to rebuild or rehabilitate for people to go back to the jihadists.
Sebastian Usher. It's been nearly 50 years since US forces left Vietnam after a long and bloody war in which they ultimately failed to stop the spread of communism throughout the country. Washington and Hanoi have since forged strong ties, but the fallout from the war lingers on through Agent Orange. The US sprayed 80 million litres of this toxic chemical over South Vietnam in a bid to flush out Viet Cong guerrillas by depriving them of tree cover and food. Decades later, Agent Orange is still being linked to cancer, birth defects and other disabilities. Now Washington has announced a $180 million cleanup project at an old US storage facility outside Ho Chi Minh City, where Agent Orange contaminated the soil and sediment. Richard Guthrie is a chemical weapons expert. He spoke to the BBC's Julian Marshall.
The toxic part of Agent Orange is another compound called dioxin, and actually it's a really important lesson of history. The herbicide itself was not that dangerous to humans. It was obviously dangerous to plants. It was designed to kill them and make them die back. But within the mix, from the production, was this dioxin which is harmful to humans. So when the first challenges were made about Agent Orange, people checked the pure Agent Orange, and they did tests on animals, and they were going, this isn't producing the results that people are seeing on the ground. It was only when people understood the impurities in the mix used in real life by the US Air Force that people understood what the toxicity problem was.
Why was dioxin added?
It wasn't added. It was a byproduct of the production. When you produce a complicated chemical, like the herbicide used in Agent Orange, part of the effort you take is to remove impurities that might interfere with the process. The dioxin, as it happened, didn't interfere with the production process, so it was part of the mix that was left behind. So it was an accident. It wasn't deliberately introduced, but that accident, of course, cost a lot of people dearly, because the real world impact of that material was a huge long-term effect.
So why is it still present and potentially dangerous in Vietnam?
Yes, dioxins, unfortunately, are very resilient in the environment, and they get absorbed into animals, into plants, and they essentially get recycled, because as then the plant life decays, sometimes the dioxin remains in the ground. It's a very difficult and a very challenging problem to clean this all up, because it often means removing earth and taking it to another location.
So that's what's happening at the Bin Ho Air Base now?
Yes, there was a difficulty at the time that these materials are quite corrosive as well as damaging to plants. So there were leaks out of the containers that these things were held in. So at the air bases is quite a high concentration of these materials. So it's very sensible to try and scoop that earth out, try and either clean it up or take it away to be disposed of somewhere else.
I mean, a high concentration at the airbase, but lesser concentrations over a vast area of Vietnam where Agent Orange was sprayed. Has any attention been given to that in the past?
Well, there have been hotspots occasionally that people have attempted to clear up, but it's a tremendously difficult problem. How do you deal with a low concentration over a large area? And in fact, the whole Agent Orange story is a key one in understanding about environmental impacts of the military. If you look at previous wars, the environmental impacts were normally very close by where the military action was taking. So the First World War, the damage to the environment around the trenches. The Vietnam War is the first war where there was a widespread environmental problem. In fact, it led to a global treaty called the Environmental Modification Convention that came into force because of the environmental impact of this more widespread military action. How you clean up low concentrations over a wide area, it's almost impossible. It's a problem that's going to last for decades to come.
Weapons expert Richard Guthrie. Still to come on this podcast, the unlikely residents of Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral who survived last week's fire. Bees.
They were on Earth before us and they will be after us. I'm definitely convinced of that.
The Spanish cities of Ceuta and Melilla are geographical anomalies. Situated on the northern coast of Africa, next to Morocco, they are legally part of Spain. But they are also a rare corner of the world where the two continents are connected by land. That makes both cities attractive for migrants who use the cities as gateways into Europe. Among them are Moroccan children. Guy Hedgecoe now reports from Ceuta.
It's night time in Ceuta's port area, where a group of Moroccan teenage boys are gathered. They're explaining to me how each day they try to stow away on vehicles that are boarding the ferries due to cross the Mediterranean to the Spanish mainland. Imad arrived in Ceuta 2 months ago. He's been sleeping in abandoned cars by the port.
It's dangerous when you hide underneath the trailers of the trucks because there are parts that are hot and you can get burned and the wheels can crush you. But if there is a trailer full of merchandise, you can climb in and hide there, and that's not as dangerous.
In February, a 15-year-old boy was crushed to death by a truck as he tried to hide underneath it. Dozens of Moroccan boys live this life in Ceuta. Some stay in shelters provided by local authorities, but many, like Imad, prefer to sleep rough near the port so they can try to dodge the patrolling civil guards and stow away on the ferries. I'm at Tarajal, a border crossing point on the Mediterranean coast between Ceuta and Morocco. If I look to my left, 100 metres away or so, I can see Morocco and Africa stretching away to the south. Where I am, I'm in Ceuta and therefore in Spain and Europe. Now, the only thing here which separates Ceuta from Morocco and therefore Europe from Africa is an extremely high border fence, a 6-metre high border fence which is covered in razor wire to try and discourage people from climbing it. Ceuta and its sister city Melilla may be part of Spain, but they're not part of the Schengen space, which allows free movement throughout the European Union. So the young Moroccans who come here, some legally with the help of parents, cannot just enter the EU, which explains why so many risk their lives. I'm watching a dozen Moroccan boys who are having their weekly football practice. This is one of a number of activities organised by the local authorities along with Malaga University to help unaccompanied foreigners under the age of 18 here in Ceuta. Shema Sharif is a psychologist who works with many of the boys, giving them emotional support as well as food and clothing.
They come because of all the economic and social difficulties in Morocco. From what I've seen, they are prepared to put up with any conditions, however bad, so long as they can achieve their objective.
But while some in Ceuta help, others are less welcoming. At a rally of the far-right political party Vox, speakers said the city was being invaded. With general and local elections approaching, the young Moroccans have become a live political issue.
Guy Hedgecoe. Film director Roman Polanski has been a fugitive from the US legal system since 1978, when, after pleading guilty to having sexual intercourse with a 13-year-old girl, he fled to France to avoid prison time. Now the 85-year-old Oscar winner is suing the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which hands out the coveted awards. Jason Kay reports.
Within days of the first sexual assault allegations being levelled at the disgraced film producer Harvey Weinstein, he became the first person to be thrown out of the Academy for more than a decade. 2 more expulsions followed a few months later, on the same day. The comedian Bill Cosby, who'd just been convicted of sexual assault, and Roman Polanski, more than 40 years after his conviction. Polanski's lawyer has questioned why he was expelled from the Academy on the same day as Bill Cosby, when the organisation had known about his situation for decades, and had even given him an Oscar during that time. He said he'd been kicked out of the organisation without warning and without a chance to respond. In a statement, the Academy said its procedures had been fair and reasonable, and it stood by its decision.
Jason Kay. 6 years ago, Mitsuhiro Iwamoto made headlines when his attempt to sail across the Pacific Ocean was scuttled after a whale sunk his boat. Undeterred, Hiro has just completed the 14,000-kilometre, 2-month non-stop journey on his second attempt. What's even more remarkable is that Hiro is the first blind person to complete the trip. He was accompanied by a sighted navigator, Doug Smith. Julian Marshall spoke to the pair after they landed on the Japanese coast. Hiro told him how it felt to complete the epic voyage.
It was excellent. It was very good reward since we had a very, very bad weather. So we were struggling a lot. So reward at the goal was excellent.
And Doug, what kind of assistance did you give?
Well, it was basically a matter of teamwork. It was a matter of combining Hiro's experience and desire and his optimism with my ability to kind of help arrange the trip and the logistics and to have the boat. So definitely a matter of teamwork.
So you told Hiro where he was going, and Hiro steered the vessel and managed the sail. Is that right, Hiro?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, everything in terms of the weather reports and forecasts and the status of the boats and stuff, I would, to the extent that he couldn't hear it directly on his own device, which he had the ability to hear some of that directly from his own device, I would tell him. And based on that information, we say, okay, why don't we do X, Y, and Z?
And I listened to the boat speed and the boat directions with my iPhone apps, so I can manage that. But we talked when to tack and when to drive, those things.
And Hiro, you can't see, but you could hear the sounds of the ocean.
I could hear, yes. And I could feel the boat movement of boat vibrations and so on. Without sight, I can do more than regular people think. So my message is not only to blind people or disabled people, but to ordinary people. Don't limit yourself. Limitation is in your brain.
And what were the sounds of the ocean, Hiro?
Sound was very nice. Sometimes very smooth from the wind from back and boat is flat and it's nice sound. But once we had to sail upwind and big wind, bam, 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 with the wind, with wind and waves, you cannot sleep. And inside you cannot walk. So step by step, to make a next step, it took sometimes 5 seconds or to think when to take a next step with waves.
And this time round, you didn't run into any whales?
No. So I say 6 years ago, yes, I had a collision with the whale. So I hate the, whale because that was, miserable. And a life raft for 11 hours with 15-foot waves and 30 knots wind, But now I relieved.
Also, I have a confession. I didn't tell you. But like on the third day of the trip, there was a beautiful, I think it was a humpback whale.
Oh.
And it was gorgeous. And it was swimming exactly the opposite way. So I took a video, but I didn't tell you until now. I thought that might scare
There you go, he's telling me.
I did see the whale.
Mitsuhiro Iwamoto, the first blind sailor to cross the Pacific. Finally, the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral last Monday drastically altered the Paris skyline, destroying the building's wooden roof and collapsing its spire. But, in spite of the damage, tens of thousands of bees that were being kept on the cathedral roof to supplement the country's declining bee population survived the blaze. Our Paris correspondent Hugh Schofield reports.
For 6 years, they've been keeping bees on the roof of Notre Dame. One might have thought that the inferno would have reduced the 3 hives to a large pool of wax. But no, according to Sybille Moulin of the company that looks after the hives, all appears to be in order.
The day after, we had pictures taken by drones, and I could see the 3 dots made by the roof of the hives, and nothing was in front, nothing that looked like melted wax. And then on Thursday, Nicolas, my boss, met André on the pavement, and he said that he'd seen bees going back and forth into the hives.
Luckily, the hives were not on the part of the roof that burned, but on the sacristy, a much lower level. Night was falling when the fire broke out, so the bees should have been settling down to rest. Sybille Moulin said they were delighted by news that they'd survived, but not surprised.
I have faith in them. They were on Earth before us and they will be after us. I'm definitely convinced of that, even with whatever we do, pesticides, and I'm always positive, and I know that they will survive, definitely.
Christian writers of antiquity saw bees as an inspiration for the church, a community of workers toiling for a common good. At Eastertide at Notre Dame, they're providing another symbol of life and hope.
Hugh Schofield. And that is all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News Podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can. Just send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Claire McDonnell, and until next time, goodbye.